They gave him the rope his son had swung from. He didn't speak, just placed his badge in the flames and watched it curl like skin. The tin star, symbol of a law that had slept through the murder of his only child, blackened and warped in the hearth's gut. The fire ate the silver polish first, then the brass beneath, turning it to a bruised, anonymous lump. He watched until it was nothing more than another coal in the grate, indistinguishable from the ash of yesterday's fire. The men from the town council who had brought the rope, a length of coarse hemp, coiled like a sleeping snake, shifted their weight in the doorway of his small office. They had ridden hard for 2 days to find him on his circuit, their faces grim with the performance of sorrow. Mayor Barlow, a man whose spine was made of candle wax, held his hat in both hands, twisting the brim. "Marshal Jett," Barlow began, his voice thin as frost on a window pane. We are deeply sorry for your loss, for the town's loss. Daniel was a good boy." Ransom did not turn from the fire. The heat was a living thing on his face, a stark contrast to the ice that had taken root in his chest. He could feel their eyes on his back, could feel the cheap pity radiating from them. They wanted a reaction. They wanted tears or a roar of rage, something they could understand and manage. He gave them only the rigid line of his shoulders. The rope lay on his desk. He had not touched it yet, but he could feel its texture under his skin, the rough fibers that had bitten into the soft flesh of his son's neck. Daniel. The name was a shard of glass in his throat. It was Silas Croft's word against his. Another councilman, a merchant named Gable, offered into the silence. Croft's girl, she said Daniel forced himself on her. Croft found them, rallied some men. It all happened so fast, Ransom, before we could get a handle on it. A lie. Ransom knew it was a lie with the same certainty that he knew the sun would rise on a world his son would not see. Daniel was gentle to a fault, a boy who rescued fallen birds and couldn't bear to see a horse whipped. He was quiet and steady, the best part of his mother, the part of Ransom that the wilderness had not yet scoured away. The idea of him forcing himself on anyone was a grotesque joke told by a hangman. He finally turned, his face a mask carved from old wood, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been at sunrise. He looked at the 3 men, seeing not pillars of the community, but hollow reeds bending in the wind of one man's power. Silas Croft, a cattle baron who thought the prairie was his personal kingdom and the law was something to be stepped over like a loose stone. "Where is my son?" Ransom's voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones grinding together deep underground. It was the first thing he had said. Barlow flinched. "He's at the undertaker's, Marshal. We had him cut down proper. Reverend Mills said some words." Proper. The word hung in the air, obscene and foul. There was nothing proper about a boy of 19 hanging from a gallows built in a drunken hurry. Ransom's gaze drifted back to the rope on his desk. He imagined the weight of his son's body, the final frantic kick. He imagined the jeering faces lit by torchlight, their breath fogging in the cold night air. The town he had protected, the people for whom he had risked his life, time and again. "Get out," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. The men scrambled to obey, stumbling over each other in their haste to leave the suffocating silence of the office. The door clicked shut, and Ransom was alone with the fire, the rope, and the ghost of the badge that had defined him. He walked to the desk, and finally, slowly, reached for the rope. It was cold, stiff. He ran his thumb over the knot, a hangman's knot, tied with brutal efficiency. This was the last thing his son had felt, this rough, uncaring fiber. He did not weep. The well of his tears had frozen over. There was only the cold, clear certainty of what had to be done. The law was dead. It had died with his son. What was left was reckoning. He coiled the rope tighter, the motion precise and practiced, and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He placed it inside, next to a spare box of 45 cartridges and a faded photograph of his late wife, her smile a memory from another lifetime. He closed the drawer. The fire in the hearth crackled, a hungry, waiting sound. The badge was gone, consumed. He was no longer Marshal Jett. He was just a father, and the town of Redemption had a debt to pay in blood. The ride back to Redemption was a journey through a frozen hell of his own making. The wind was a razor, slicing across the plains, sculpting the snow into waves that mimicked a petrified ocean. His horse, Ajax, a stoic gray gelding, bowed his head against the gale, his breath pluming in white clouds. Ransom rode hunched in the saddle, the collar of his sheepskin coat turned up, but the cold was inside him. It was a cold that no fire could touch. With every mile, the town drew closer, not as a sanctuary, but as a tomb. He saw it in his mind's eye, the single muddy street, the false-fronted buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness, the hastily built gallows standing stark against the winter sky. He had built that town, not with his hands, but with his gun and his will. He had driven out the rustlers, faced down the gunslingers, and brokered peace with the Cheyenne when the army had failed. He had made it a place where a man could raise a family, where his own son could grow up without the shadow of the gun that had ruled his own youth. He had believed in the law, in its slow, grinding, but ultimate fairness. He had traded his own peace for the town's, and they had repaid him by hanging his son. Memory was a treacherous country. He saw Daniel as a small boy, perched on the rail of the corral, his face alight with wonder as Ransom broke a wild colt. He saw him at 12, struggling to read a letter from his aunt back east, his brow furrowed in concentration. He saw him just last month, standing tall and proud, telling his father he was sweet on Ellery Kane, the blacksmith's daughter. "She has eyes the color of a summer sky, Pa," he'd said, a rare blush on his cheeks. A good boy, a gentle boy, a dead boy. When the rooftops of Redemption finally appeared on the horizon, dark smudges against the unrelenting white, something inside Ransom settled. The grief was still there, a great cold stone in his gut, but it was now overlaid with a crystalline purpose. He was not returning as the marshal. He was returning as an omen. He entered the town at dusk. The lamps were being lit in the windows, casting yellow, fragile squares of light onto the snow-dusted street. No one hailed him. Figures scurried into doorways, faces appeared in windows, then vanished. The silence was a confession. They knew who he was. They knew what they had done. His office, the marshal's office, was dark. He rode past it without a glance. He rode past the saloon, the general store, the church whose bell had not tolled for his son. He rode straight to the undertaker's. The building smelled of sawdust, formaldehyde, and cheap soap. Elias Thorne, the undertaker, a man as thin and dry as a corn husk, met him at the door. Thorne's professional solemnity cracked when he saw the look on Ransom's face. "Marshal," he stammered, wringing his hands. I did my best by him. Cleaned him up. "Show me." Ransom's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Thorne led him into the back room. A single pine box rested on a pair of sawhorses. The lid was closed. For a long moment, Ransom just stood there, his gaze fixed on the coffin. This was the final border, the last step. Everything on the other side of this moment would be different. He could feel the change happening inside him, a final hardening, a shedding of the man he used to be. "Open it," he commanded. Thorne fumbled with the lid, his hands shaking. He lifted it away, and there he was, Daniel. They had dressed him in his Sunday suit, the one he hated because the collar was too tight. His face was pale, waxy, and unnaturally serene. But the serenity was a lie. Ransom's eyes went immediately to the neck. Thorne had tried to hide it with a high collar and a cravat, but the bruised, abraded line was still there, a dark necklace of violence, the mark of the rope. Ransom reached out a hand, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly, and touched his son's cold cheek. The ice in his own chest seemed to crack, a searing pain lancing through him. He had failed. While he was out chasing some petty cattle thief 50 miles away, his son had been dragged to his death. His duty had killed his blood. He stood there for a time that had no measure, the undertaker's fearful breathing the only sound in the room. Then he straightened up, his face set like granite. "Who built the gallows?" he asked. Thorne swallowed hard. "Some of Croft's ranch hands, Marshal. Jed and Shorty. They were proud of their work. Said it was the fastest gallows ever raised in this territory." Ransom nodded slowly. "Leave the lid off. I'll be back for him." He turned and walked out, leaving the undertaker trembling in the cold room with the dead boy. He did not go to his own house. His house was a place of ghosts now, the rooms echoing with a silence that was louder than a scream. Instead, he went to the jail. He unlocked the door. The air inside was stale and colder than the street. A thin layer of dust covered his desk. He lit a single lantern, the small flame pushing back the oppressive darkness. He sat in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and pulled open the bottom drawer. The coiled rope was there, waiting. He took it out and laid it on the desk, its shadow long and distorted in the lamplight. Then he waited. The town knew he was back. Let them wonder. Let them fear the coming of the dawn. The night was his. The first visitor was Deputy Finch. He scurried in like a rat, his eyes darting around the dim office, avoiding Ransom's gaze. He was a young man, barely older than Daniel, but his face was already etched with the craven lines of compromise. "Marshal," Finch said, his voice a squeak, I tried to stop them. I told them it wasn't right, that you'd want a proper trial." Ransom said nothing. He just looked at Finch, his eyes cold and empty as a winter sky. He saw the lie in the boy's shifting gaze, the sweat on his upper lip. Finch had stood by. He had watched. He had probably held the torch for them. "There were too many of them," Finch pleaded, his voice rising in panic. "Croft had them all liquored up and angry. What could I do? I'm just one man." "You wore a badge," Ransom said. The words were quiet, but they cut through Finch's excuses like a knife. It was chaos, Marshal. They dragged him from his room at the boarding house. Croft's daughter was screaming. It was a convincing performance. Ransom's hand rested on the rope on his desk. He didn't look at it, but Finch's eyes were drawn to it, mesmerized by the horror of it. The deputy's face went pale. Is that? "They were proud of their work," Ransom said, his voice a dead monotone. "Fastest gallows in the territory." Finch began to tremble. "I swear to you, Marshal, I didn't have a hand in it. I was just there." Ransom slowly stood up. He was not a tall man, but in that moment he seemed to fill the room, a looming figure of judgment. He walked around the desk and stood in front of his deputy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch his gun. He just looked at him, a look that stripped away all the lies and left only the shivering, pathetic truth. "Go to the cells," Ransom said. "Lock yourself in the last one." "Marshal? Why?" Finch stammered. "Because the law you failed to uphold is no longer your protector. My son had no trial. He had no cell. He had a rope and a mob. You will have a steel door. It's more than you deserve. Go." Finch, his face ashen, stumbled toward the back of the office, toward the two small, iron-barred cells. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit it in the lock. The heavy door clanged shut, the sound echoing in the stillness. The lock clicked. Ransom went back to his desk, sat down, and continued his vigil. One man down. The rest of the town was still out there, sleeping in their warm beds, believing the nightmare was over. They were wrong. It had just begun. He spent the night in that chair, the rope his only companion. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. Grief and purpose were a potent fuel. He listened to the sounds of the town dying down, the last drunken shouts from the saloon, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer as he banked his forge, the lonely whistle of the wind scouring the eaves of the jailhouse. He thought about Ellery Kane, the blacksmith's daughter, the girl Daniel had been sweet on. She was the key. She had seen it. Finch's words, a convincing performance, replayed in his mind. A performance. An act. Ellery knew the truth, but in a town owned by Silas Croft, the truth was a dangerous thing to possess. At the first hint of gray light in the window, he rose. He left the rope on the desk, a silent sentinel. He walked out into the biting cold of the dawn. The street was empty. The snow crunched under his boots. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, his destination clear. He passed the gallows, a skeletal finger pointing at the bruised sky. He didn't look at it. Not yet. The blacksmith's forge was at the end of the street, the house attached. A thin tendril of smoke curled from the chimney. He knocked on the door, the sound unnaturally loud in the frozen silence. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. A man's face, broad and smudged with soot, peered out. It was Thomas Kane, Ellery's father. A good man, a strong man, but his eyes were filled with a deep, hunted fear. "Marshal," Kane said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He didn't open the door further. "I need to speak with your daughter," Ransom said. Kane's face tightened. "She has nothing to say. She saw nothing." "Everyone in this town saw something, Thomas, even if it was just the inside of their own eyelids. Let me speak to her." "You'll bring trouble down on us," Kane hissed. Croft's trouble is already here," Ransom said, his voice dropping lower. "It's been here since he strung up my boy. Now are you going to let me in, or am I going to ask you again in front of the whole town?" The threat was unspoken, but clear. Kane's shoulders sagged in defeat. He opened the door. The house was small and clean, smelling of soap and baking bread. A fire burned in the hearth. Ellery was sitting at a small wooden table, a half-empty cup of coffee in her hands. She was pale, her eyes wide and haunted. They were indeed the color of a summer sky, but a sky shadowed by a coming storm. She looked so young, so fragile. He could see why Daniel had fallen for her. He took off his hat. It was a gesture of respect from a lifetime ago, a habit that died hard. "Miss Kane," he said. She didn't answer. She just stared at him, her knuckles white where she gripped her cup. "I'm not the marshal anymore," he said, trying to soften his voice, an instrument he'd almost forgotten how to play. "I'm just Daniel's father." At the mention of the name, a single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She hastily wiped it away. They said he was hurting you," Ransom stated, not as a question, but as a fact to be addressed. She shook her head, a tiny, violent motion. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Never. He was kind." "Then tell me what happened, Ellery. Tell me the truth." Her father made a warning sound from the doorway. "Ellery, don't." She looked from her father's terrified face to Ransom's impassive one. He didn't press her. He just waited. His stillness, a force more powerful than any threat. He was a rock in the middle of a river of fear, and for a moment she looked as if she might cling to it. "I can't," she finally breathed, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "They'll kill us. Croft will kill us." "They already killed my son," Ransom said, the words flat and cold. "What more can they do to me?" He looked at her for a long moment more, then nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. He had. Fear was a strong cage. He turned and walked to the door, pausing beside her father. "Keep her safe, Thomas," he said, his voice low. "Because if anything happens to her, I will burn this town to the ground and salt the earth." He walked back out into the dawn. The sun was now a sliver of bloody orange on the horizon. The town was beginning to stir. He saw men watching him from alleys and doorways. He knew his visit to the Canes had been noted. Good. Let the fear spread, let it curdle their courage. His next stop was the general store. He pushed the door open, a small bell announcing his arrival. Gable, the merchant who had been with Barlow, was behind the counter. He froze, a sack of flour in his hands. Ransom walked to the back of the store, to the shelves lined with tools and supplies. He picked up a heavy hammer and a handful of long, thick nails. He took a coil of new rope, thicker and stronger than the one in his office. He carried the items to the counter and placed them down. He didn't speak. He just looked at Gable, his eyes daring him to ask for payment. Gable, sweating despite the morning chill, just nodded, unable to meet Ransom's gaze. Ransom picked up his purchases and walked out. The bell tinkled mockingly behind him. Now he walked toward the gallows. He could feel every eye in town on his back. He stepped up onto the rough-hewn platform. The wood was new, raw, splintery. He could see the haste in the construction, the uneven cuts, the nails not driven home, a monument to mob rule. He dropped the hammer and nails. He took the new rope and, with practiced hands, tied a hangman's knot. A proper one. A perfect one. He threw the end of the rope over the high crossbeam, the same beam from which his son had dangled. He pulled it tight, testing its strength. It held. The new noose swayed gently in the wind, a stark invitation against the gray sky. Then he waited. He stood on the platform, a solitary figure, the hammer at his feet, the empty noose his silent partner. He was turning the instrument of their crime into his stage. He would not hunt them in the dark. He would make them face him in the daylight, on the very spot where they had renounced their own humanity. Mayor Barlow was the first to approach, his face a pasty mask of anxiety. He stopped at the foot of the gallows, craning his neck to look up at Ransom. "Marshal? Ransom. What is this? What are you doing?" "My name is Ransom Jett," he replied, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I am no longer your marshal. I am a citizen of this town, and I am here to see justice done." "Justice was done," Barlow insisted, his voice cracking. "Croft's girl." "Lied," Ransom finished for him, "and you know it. You all know it." A small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the grim spectacle. They kept their distance, a ragged semicircle of fear and guilt. They were the faces he had seen at church socials, the men he had shared drinks with, the women who had once offered his wife a cup of sugar. Now they looked at him as if he were a stranger, a demon conjured from their own bad conscience. "This is madness," Barlow whispered. "No," Ransom said. "Madness was hanging a boy without a trial. Madness is letting a liar and a murderer dictate the law. This is clarity." He looked past Barlow, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, landing on the swinging doors of the saloon. As if summoned, Silas Croft stepped out, flanked by two of his hard-faced ranch hands, Jed and Shorty, the gallows builders. Croft was a big man, florid and fleshy, used to getting his own way. He wore an expensive coat and a look of supreme arrogance, but Ransom could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. Croft strode forward, his boots crunching on the snow, until he stood beside Barlow, a king surveying his domain. "Jett," he boomed, his voice a practiced display of authority. "Get down from there. Your grief is making you foolish. The town has dealt with the matter. It's over." "It's over when I say it's over," Ransom said, his voice quiet but carrying more weight than Croft's bellow. "You murdered my son." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your son was a rapist. He got what he deserved. My own daughter told me what he did. Are you calling my girl a liar?" "I'm calling you a murderer," Ransom repeated, his gaze unwavering. "You whispered a lie into the ears of angry, drunken men because my son knew something about you. Something about the cattle you've been rebranding, the ones that belong to John Chisholm. Daniel was too honest for this town, Croft. Too honest for you. A murmur went through the crowd. Croft's face darkened, the florid color deepening to a dangerous purple. The lie about his daughter was one thing, an accusation of cattle rustling was another. That was a hanging offense. You're insane, Jet. You have no proof. I have a witness, Ransom said, his voice clear and sharp. He didn't look toward the blacksmith's shop, but he felt the weight of that knowledge. And I have this. He gestured to the noose, to the gallows. The law you made for my son. I find it fitting that it should serve you as well. Croft's men, Jed and Shorty, put their hands on their guns. You're not taking the boss anywhere, old man, Jed snarled. Ransom ignored them. His focus was entirely on Croft. You will stand trial, Silas, right here, in front of the whole town. You will confess what you did, or I will start taking apart your whole rotten empire, piece by piece, starting with these 2 dogs at your heel. He bent down, picked up the hammer, its weight familiar and solid in his hand. He looked at Jed and Shorty, his eyes promising a world of pain. They were killers, but they were hired killers. Their courage was bought and paid for, and it didn't run deep. They looked from Ransom's cold, dead eyes to their boss, and for the first time, they looked uncertain. The standoff stretched, time measured by the slow creak of the gallows in the wind. The town watched, silent and breathless. This was the moment, the breaking point, the choice between the comfortable lie and the terrible truth. Ransom stood alone on the platform, armed with nothing but a carpenter's hammer and the weight of his righteousness. He had no badge, no authority, no law to back him. He had only his grief, forged into a weapon, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it would be enough. He had already lost everything that mattered. He had nothing left to fear. Croft, seeing the wavering loyalty in his men's eyes and the seeds of doubt being planted in the crowd, made his move. He wasn't a man to be tried by a disgraced lawman on a makeshift stage. He was Silas Croft. He made the rules. You're a dead man, Jet. He spat and drew his pistol. But Ransom was already moving. He didn't reach for the Colt Peacemaker at his hip, the gun that had been his companion for 30 years. That was the tool of the law. This was personal. As Croft's gun cleared leather, Ransom threw the hammer. It spun through the air, a dark, heavy blur, and struck Croft's wrist with a sickening crack of bone. The pistol flew from his numb fingers, landing in the snow. Croft screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and outrage, clutching his shattered hand. In the same fluid motion, Ransom leaped from the gallows platform, landing light as a cat despite his years. He drew his knife, not the gun, the blade a sliver of cold steel in the morning light. Before Jed or Shorty could react, he was on them. He slammed the pommel of the knife into Shorty's temple, dropping him senseless into the snow. Jed managed to draw his gun, but Ransom was inside his reach, a phantom of gray wool and cold fury. He deflected the gun barrel with his forearm, the shot going wild, deafeningly loud in the tense silence. He drove his shoulder into Jed's chest, sending him staggering back, then swept his leg, dumping the bigger man on his back. The point of Ransom's knife came to rest in the soft hollow of Jed's throat. Drop it. Ransom's voice was a graveyard whisper. Or I'll open you up right here. Jed, his eyes wide with terror, the bravado gone, let the gun fall from his hand. The crowd gasped. It had taken less than 5 seconds. The invincible Silas Croft was howling, his hired guns neutralized, and Ransom Jet stood over them, not with the righteous fury of a lawman, but with the cold, brutal efficiency of a wolf. He kicked the guns away, then turned his attention back to Croft, who was now cradling his broken wrist, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. Ransom walked toward him, the knife still in his hand. The crowd shrank back, creating a wide circle around the 2 men. My son didn't get to cry out, Ransom said, his voice low and conversational, yet every person in the street could hear it. He didn't have anyone to plead his case. Did he, Silas? He stood over the whimpering cattle baron. He wasn't looking at the man's face. He was looking at the people of the town, at Mayor Barlow, whose face was the color of tallow, at Gable, the merchant, who was trying to hide behind a post, at all the silent, watching faces. "You all listened to his lies," Ransom said, his voice growing stronger, a prosecutor addressing a guilty jury. "You drank his whiskey and let his hate fill your bellies. You watched my son, a boy you've known since he was in diapers, get dragged to that gallows. Did any of you speak up? Did any of you say, 'Wait, let the marshal get back, let's have a trial'?" Silence. A deep, shamed silence. The only sound was the wind and Croft's pathetic moans. "No," Ransom answered his own question. "You didn't. You were scared, or you were drunk, or you just didn't care. You let this man," he nudged Croft with the toe of his boot, "turn you into a lynch mob. You let him murder justice in the middle of your own street." He bent down and hauled Croft to his feet by the collar of his expensive coat. Croft yelped in pain. Ransom ignored him, dragging him toward the gallows. "Now," he said, his voice ringing with chilling authority. "Now we have the trial." He shoved Croft up the steps of the gallows. The big man stumbled, falling to his knees on the platform. Ransom turned to face the town. "I need my witness," he called out, his eyes finding the blacksmith shop at the end of the street. The door was still closed. "Ellery Kane, I know you can hear me. I know you're afraid. But there is a time for fear and a time for truth. If you let fear rule you today, you will live with the ghost of my son for the rest of your life. You will be a prisoner in this town forever. Come out now. Come out and tell them what you saw." The silence stretched. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Ransom waited, his patience absolute. He had set the stage. He had broken the king. Now it was up to the conscience of one young woman. The door to the blacksmith's house creaked open. Ellery stepped out, her father just behind her, his face a torment of fear. She was wrapped in a thin shawl, her face pale but her chin held high. She took a deep breath, and then she began to walk, her steps small but steady, through the parted crowd, toward the gallows, toward the truth. Ellery Kane walked through the silent sea of her neighbors, as if she were walking to her own execution. Every eye was on her, a weight of expectation and dread. She kept her gaze fixed on Ransom, who stood on the gallows platform like a weathered statue, his presence the only solid thing in her swirling world of fear. Her father trailed behind her, a helpless shadow. When she reached the foot of the gallows, she stopped, her hands twisting the fringe of her shawl. "Tell them," Ransom said, his voice gentle now, a startling contrast to the violence of moments before. "Tell them what you told me. Tell them the truth." She took a shaky breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and looked not at Croft, who was still kneeling and sobbing, but at the faces in the crowd. The faces of people who had known her whole life, who had watched her grow up. It wasn't like he said," she began, her voice small but clear in the unnatural quiet. "Daniel, he never touched me. He would never." Her voice gained strength. "We were just talking. By the creek. We met there sometimes." She glanced at Croft's daughter, who was watching from the porch of the hotel, her face a mixture of terror and guilt. She was supposed to be meeting Jed," Ellery said, her gaze flicking to the groaning man on the ground. "Her father forbade it. She was afraid he'd find out. Daniel and we were just there. When Mr. Croft rode up, he was in a rage. His daughter, she got scared. She pointed at Daniel and she lied. She said he'd attacked her to save herself from her father's wrath." A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned from Ellery to Croft, then to his daughter, who shrank back from the railing. "I was hiding," Ellery continued, tears now streaming freely down her face. I was so scared. I watched them. Mr. Croft didn't even ask a question. He just hit Daniel. He and Jed and Shorty, they dragged him back to town. They said they'd caught a rapist, and everyone just believed them. She looked around at the faces, her expression one of sorrowful accusation. You were all so eager to believe the worst. The truth, once spoken, hung in the air, undeniable and ugly. It settled on the townspeople, a cloak of collective guilt. They had been fools. Worse, they had been cowards. They had been accomplices. Ransom let the silence stretch, letting her words sink in. Then he turned his attention back to the kneeling Croft. He picked up the new rope, the one with the perfectly tied noose. You heard the witness, Silas, he said. You used your daughter's fear to kill a boy who was a threat to your criminal enterprise. You turned this town into your personal mob. The law you twisted to serve your own ends has now come for you. He uncoiled the rope. Croft looked up, his eyes wide with primal terror. No, he whimpered. No, Jet, you can't. This isn't law. This is murder. Is it? Ransom asked the crowd. Is this murder? Or is this what justice looks like when the law is dead? He had no trial. Should you? He looked at Mayor Barlow. What say you, Mayor? Shall we convene a court? Shall we find a judge who isn't on Croft's payroll? Shall we pick a jury that isn't terrified of him? We can do that. It might take a month, a year, or we can have justice now. The kind you all seemed to prefer just 2 nights ago. Quick, efficient. Barlow stood paralyzed, his face slick with sweat. He looked from Croft's pathetic, begging face to Ransom's implacable one. He looked at the faces of his townspeople, who were now looking back at him, their expressions a mixture of shame and a frightening, dawning bloodlust. They had been made fools of. Their guilt was transmuting into rage, and that rage needed a target. It was Thomas Kane, the blacksmith, who spoke first. He stepped forward, his big hands clenched into fists. He's right. Kane's voice boomed, full of a father's righteous anger. My girl could have been next. Any of our children could have been. Croft made us monsters. Let him hang from the gallows he inspired. A chorus of assent rose from the crowd. Hang him! Someone shouted. The cry was taken up by others, growing from a murmur to a roar. Hang the bastard! The mob had been reborn, but now it had a new target. They began to surge forward, their faces twisted with a fury that was part justice, part self-loathing. No! Ransom's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. He held up a hand, and to his own surprise, they stopped. They still saw him as the marshal. The habit of his authority was that strong. You will not have him, Ransom said, his voice cold. You lost the right to pass judgment when you stood by and watched my son die. You are not worthy of this justice. You are only worthy of the shame. He turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate contempt. He faced Croft. He held the noose. The crowd quieted, watching, confused. This is not for them, Ransom said, his voice for Croft alone. This is not for the law. This is for Daniel. He reached for Croft, but then he stopped. He looked at the noose in his hand, then at the crossbeam above. He saw his son's face, not as it was in the coffin, but as it was in life, smiling, gentle, full of a hope that this world had crushed. And something inside him broke, not with a sound, but with a deep, shuddering finality. Vengeance was ashes in his mouth. Killing Croft wouldn't bring Daniel back. It wouldn't erase the image of the rope burn on his son's neck. It wouldn't fill the echoing silence in his house. It would just be one more killing in a town already drowning in sin. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rope. He looked over the pathetic, broken man at his feet and felt nothing. Just a vast, empty wasteland where his heart used to be. The core theme of the prompt was, when law fails the innocent, justice becomes a personal ruin. He had sought justice, and he had found it. But it had hollowed him out. leaving him with nothing but the ruins of the man he once was. This was his ruin. Not the killing, but the knowing that the killing would solve nothing. He turned to the town, his face a canvas of profound weariness. "He is yours," Ransom said, his voice flat. "Do with him what you will. Take him to the federal court in Cheyenne, or let him rot in my jail. It makes no difference to me." He looked at Deputy Finch, who was still locked in the cell, his face pressed against the bars. "Finch, you're the law now. This is your town." He stepped off the gallows, leaving Croft sobbing on the platform. The crowd parted for him, their rage and bloodlust deflated, replaced by a confused awe. He had won. He had brought the king to his knees. And then he had walked away. He walked to the undertaker's. Thorne was waiting, his face pale. Ransom didn't speak. He went into the back room. Daniel was still there, in his pine box. Ransom looked at his son's peaceful, dead face one last time. He reached in and gently unbuttoned the high collar, exposing the terrible mark beneath. He looked at it, searing the image into his memory. This was the truth. This was the wound that would never heal. He placed the lid on the coffin himself. With a strength born of grief, he lifted one end, and Thorne, startled into action, lifted the other. They carried the box out into the street. The crowd was still there, a silent, uncertain mass around the gallows, where Mayor Barlow and a few other men were tentatively helping Croft to his feet. Ransom ignored them all. He and Thorne slid the coffin into the back of the undertaker's wagon. Ransom climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't look back. He slapped the reins, and the horse moved forward, pulling the wagon down the main street, past the jail, past his own empty house, toward the small, wind-blasted cemetery on the hill. The ground was frozen solid. It took him hours, working with Thorne, to dig the grave. He worked in a frenzy, the pickaxe and shovel his only companions, the rhythmic thud and scrape the only sounds besides the ceaseless wind. He lowered the coffin himself, the ropes burning his raw hands. He shoveled the frozen earth back into the hole, each spadeful a final goodbye. He did not say any words. He did not pray. The sky was a sheet of iron, and God was nowhere to be found. When it was done, he stood before the simple wooden cross Thorne had provided, a mound of frozen dirt in a field of white, a life reduced to a scar on the landscape. He thought of the ending line he was supposed to fulfill. The wind, his son's name. He went back to the gallows. The street was empty now, the people having retreated into their homes to nurse their shame. Croft was gone, presumably to the jail cell Finch had vacated. The new rope and noose still hung from the beam, swaying in the wind. The hammer was still lying on the platform where he had left it. He climbed the steps one last time. He took the knife from his belt, the same knife he had held to Jed's throat. He looked at the raw, splintered wood of the main post, the wood that had witnessed his son's last moments. It was an object of obscene ugliness, a monument to the town's failure. He would give it a new purpose. He would make it a headstone. He pressed the tip of the blade into the wood. The work was slow, hard. He carved with a grim, meticulous precision. Each letter was a testament. Each sliver of wood that fell away was a piece of his own soul. He didn't feel the cold. He didn't feel the fatigue. He felt only the duty of a father to a son the world had forgotten too quickly. The sun was setting, staining the snow-covered prairie in hues of blood and bruised purple. The lights in the town began to flicker on again, yellow and distant. He finished the last letter as darkness fell completely. He ran his gloved hand over the carving, feeling the sharp edges of the letters cut into the wood. Daniel Jett. The wind swept across the prairie, a low, mournful sound. It whipped around the gallows, making the rope creak and sway. It carried the scent of wood smoke and the promise of a long, cold night. The wind did not carry his son's name, so he carved it into the gallows instead.